Harriet is the biographical drama about the life and specifically the early years of Harriet Tubman, and it's a pretty good film. It's well worth the watch of the main lead actress, Cynthia Erivo. Harriet is directed by Kasi Lemmons and stars Cynthia Erivo in the titular role of Harriet Tubman. The film is pretty much worth watching solely because of Cynthia's performance in the film. She does an excellent job portraying Harriet Tubman, some of the struggles she goes through, along with the emotions and stuff that she's able to display, and her character arc through the beginning of being a slave, then being a runaway slave, then being an abolitionist and freedom fighter, and conductor on the Underground Railroad. The film really focuses entirely on Harriet's character. Specifically, it starts off in the 1840s, early 1840s, when she's still a slave. Her father was a freedman, her mother's still a slave, and what happens is there's a kind of a cute little scene where they're having like a chapel, or they're holding like a religious service in front of the master's house or the slave owner's house, and her father, who is a freedman, goes and confronts the owner of Harriet at this point, because in the past, when his grandfather died or his father died, he left in his will that Harriet's mother and her children, Harriet and her family, brothers and sisters, were all supposed to be freed, which this didn't occur. And then there's kind of a tuss-up. He gets mad, yells at him, says that, you're a slave, you're born a slave, you're always going to be a slave. And, this really is disheartening to Harriet and her husband, John Tubman, who is also a freedman at this point. And he's basically told, you can't see Harriet anymore, and Harriet's father's not allowed to come back around the house or the property and see Harriet, his wife, or his other children because they're slaves, and this guy doesn't want him to have any contact with them. Well, this really kind of lights a fire in Harriet, and the film does a good job of talking about some of the more, you could say mythological, but pretty much everything that I've read about Harriet Tubman points to that she did have these spells because when she was younger, she got hit in the head, fractured her skull, and was in a coma for a little while. And when she woke up, she would go into these fits or spells where she would see things that she related as being like visions from God, or being, premonitions of the future and such. And they did a good job kind of portraying this, like showing her going to these multiple little instances where she kind of goes into her own mind and falls over, and then she sees things. Usually it's just a smattering of different images and things that, kind of lead her to interpret what's going to happen. One of the things that she sees is that, right before she's going to be sold by her master, that she should run away. She sees a horse breaking free of its bonds and taking off and running away. And she views this as a sign from God that it's time for her to go. So she does. She takes off. She, runs in the middle of the night, ends up meeting a reverend who's also part of the Underground Railroad, and helping runaway slaves to get north into the more northern states where they won't be sent back and where they can live free, specifically Philadelphia in this case. So Harriet is pursued by her old master's son, Gideon, who basically tracks her down to a bridge where she has a moment where she looks over the bridge into the river, the raging river, and he's like, I'm not going to sell you, Harriet. I'm not going to sell you. I'm going to keep you and come back and live. And she says, I'd rather live free or die. And she jumps over into the raging river, is washed off and presumed to be dead by all involved, along with her parents and her husband, John Tubman, in this instance. But she's not. She survives. She's washed down the river and then makes her way alone on foot for approximately 100 miles to Philadelphia, where she runs into, I think William Steele is his name, who's also a writer and abolitionist. He meets her, he talks to her, he gets her story, writes it down, and then he tells her, you can pick a new name. So at this point, she decides to take her mother's name, which her mother's name is Harriet, and she takes her husband's name, last name of Tubman. She becomes Harriet Tubman. I can't pronounce her full name, original name, but they used to call her Minty, and she took the name of Harriet Tubman. So it flash forwards a little bit about a year later or so, and then she starts to see more visions, and what she believes is a vision that's to lead her back to her husband John, to bring him north, because originally she was going to go with him, but she didn't want him to go with her because if he was caught as a freedman, he would then be thrown back into bondage, and she couldn't live with that. So she sees this vision, and she, talks to the other abolitionists, other Underground Railroad members in the area, about how she's going to go back and try to help her husband and help her family that's still there. She still has her mother and father, along with several brothers and sisters who are still slaves at this point. So she learns some things that she needs to, and then she starts off back on her journey down south. She meets up with her husband, who she finds out has already, believing that she was dead, he went ahead and remarried, and he also married a freed woman at the time. So there's a little bit of a tension between Harriet and him. She gets mad, she runs off, and then her father stumbles back upon her, talks to her, and then he tells her that her brothers and sisters, approximately 5 or 6 people, that they're going to be sold at auction by the Brutuses, who was her former masters, and that Harriet needs to help them out. So that's what Harriet does. She helps out her brothers and sisters, and then they go and hide in this reverend's church, where they see several other runaway slaves there, and then she leads them as well. And there's kind of a tense moment with one of her brothers, possibly an older brother, who's like, well, we need to go this way. And then Harriet's like, no, God's telling me I need to go this way. If we don't go this way, then we're going to be caught. Something's going to happen. And they have to kind of cross over a river. Well, Harriet's brother doesn't want her to go across the river because several of the people don't know how to swim. And he's not going to risk those people along with the baby that they're carrying. But Harriet wades out into the water and is able to successfully cross the river, inspiring the other folks to then follow her, in essence, making their way towards freedom. She then leads those people back to the office of Mr. Steele in Philadelphia, where he's just amazed or mystified at the fact that she was able to travel pretty much unaided through the wild and arrive with these people. And then the film starts kind of a little bit of montage sequences where Harriet's going back and forth towards the south to free more slaves. She goes multiple trips. She never gets caught. And they also make a point of noting that she doesn't lose any slaves at this point in time, that she's able to help all of her passengers on the Underground Railroad go from bondage into freedom in the northern states. The only main dislike I had with the film is a lot of these montage sequences, the musical choices were really kind of out of step for what was going on. It just seemed out of place because they would go from some real intense scenes where the focus was directly on Harriet or some of the people involved to these like montage style scenes where the music didn't really fit the tone that was being portrayed in it. And I could see it was probably an attempt to try to liven up the film a little bit, take away some of the heaviness of it, or the emotional heaviness of the scenes. But it just didn't really work. I mean, the focus is entirely on Harriet, and she is the star in this film. And she does a good job. The other supporting actors do a pretty decent job. But some of the cutting here and also some of the pacing of the film kind of drags a little bit in this midsection. But eventually it leads to the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act, where even now any of these runaway slaves in these northern states are no longer safe, because this allows slave catchers and the former masters and stuff from the south to then come into the north and take back their property, take them back and stuff like that. And at this point, all of these runaways or freed slaves then have to make their way to Canada. And there's kind of an intense scene where you have multiple people kind of standing in guard or buffer between a lot of the southern slave catchers and stuff that are trying to come back and take some of these people back into bondage. And they stand up, and there's one guy that kind of looks a little bit like John Brown. They never announced him as being John Brown, which was weird because Harriet and John Brown had a very cordial relationship once they met in 1858 up in Canada. In fact, Harriet helped John Brown plan in the raid on Harper's Ferry, but that was kind of left out of this, and I think they did that just to keep the focus squarely on Harriet Tubman in this portion of her life, and it still does a good job on it. Well, her old master Brutus and a slave catcher that he has with him, who's also like a freed black man, he goes to the house where Harriet had been staying at a boarding house that was owned by a free woman, and basically they just beat up and end up killing this free woman played by Janelle Monáe in a pretty good role. And that in turn inspires Harriet to go back and basically save her remaining sister, who had refused to leave because she still had a small child there. And Harriet makes the trip back to try to free her sister and take the rest of the Brutus as slaves. At this point, the South is kind of starting to digress or devolve into a real state of panic, and specifically because there's a lot of rumors and myths about this Moses character, which is actually Harriet, who's coming back and freeing all the slaves. So all of the slaveholders are really on edge and trying to find this person. Well, Harriet goes back. She's able to sneak in past a trap that the Brutuses had set for her with her sister's children, or her sister's remaining children that are there. But Harriet is able to kind of outwit them, tie up some of the Brutus's children, and then take her sister's child and slip on out along with freeing the remaining slaves on the Brutus's property, which has at this point sent them all into financial ruin. And there's a couple moments where you show kind of the vitriol and nastiness of these people, where they're yelling and screaming about how, these are our property, they're our entire wealth. And it's really kind of disheartening because you're able to realize and see that this is how people believed and felt back then. And it's sad that they believe that they can own someone as property. Well, Harriet, in essence, gets the last laugh, so she's able to lead these slaves out and gets towards a boat and was putting them all in the boat with kind of a boy. I think his name is Walter in the film. He is a slave catcher himself, but he kind of sees the error of his ways because he observes from a tree Harriet going through one of her spells and then correctly assessing that she needs to go to the left earlier in the film to avoid the slave catchers and such. And he kind of has a change of heart and wants to help her out. So he helps her out on several of her trips down there. Specifically on this one, he helps her out, gets the last of these slaves on this boat, and then Harriet goes off to kind of confront the slave catcher along with Gideon Brutus. And what happens is she's running, Harriet shoots at the slave catcher. He gets mad and he's like, I'm going to kill you, you bitch or whatever. And then Gideon shoots him in the back of the head, killing the slave catcher. And he's still, you can tell that there may have been something, not necessarily between them with her liking him, but you could tell he definitely was envious of Harriet in a way. He definitely wanted to possess her in multiple ways rather than just, the master-slave relationship. You could tell he probably had some kind of sexual feelings towards her and definitely felt something towards her. So there's a moment, and then Harriet pulls the gun on him, and she makes him drop the gun. He drops the gun, and then he tries to pull out his pistol, and she shoots off his fingers. And then, there's kind of a poignant moment where she gets down. She relates a vision that she had from God that kind of references a Civil War battle and then, people dying and losing and such. But then she spares his life. She leaves the gun and takes off and, goes back towards the north, towards Canada, where the film really ends at that point. And it leads into kind of a little epilogue setting where she's arriving with some of the other runaways. They make it there, and you can tell that they're really pushing for a better life. And then, like I said, it's kind of an epilogue where it cuts forward a few years into the Civil War, and Harriet is leading a black regiment down into the South in South Carolina, I believe, where they end up confronting and freeing approximately 750 slaves at this point. It then speeds up in the epilogue to where she returns to her house in, I believe, Augusta, New York, where she's got her parents there and her friends and family. And then it gives a little written description that Harriet Tubman will continue to fight for, to free all the slaves, to help them once they were free, along with suffrage and things like that, and how she would take care of the elderly, the sick, the children. And it just shows that she was 100% a great person in her own right. And it's a good thing they finally were able to get around to making this film. It's one of those biographical films that's kind of been in development hell for a number of years. And I think they did a good job specifically getting Cynthia Erivo to play the role. She does a very good job of it. And she actually kind of looks a little bit like some of the few photographs we have of Harriet Tubman. But her Oscar was well deserved. And I would say, it's certainly worth watching solely for this individual performance. There is some issues, like I said, with the pacing and plotting of the film, along with some of the musical choices and stuff, but that doesn't really take away from how good her performance is in the film, and along with some decent performances from some of the other supporting cast. And I would say I definitely recommend this film. It's well worth the 2 hours or so it takes to watch it. Other than that, thank you. Feel free to like, subscribe, and share, and have a good day.